There are moments in a mother's life that feel like second chances, not because the past has changed, but because hope quietly convinces her that maybe the future will. When my son Daniel called me that Tuesday afternoon, I almost didn't answer. He rarely called anymore. Most of our conversations had become quick text messages. Busy today. I'll call later. Work's been crazy. The kind of messages that slowly become a substitute for a relationship. I stared at my phone as it rang. His picture still made me smile. It was one I had taken nearly 20 years earlier. He was standing in our backyard holding the first bicycle he had ever learned to ride. His front tooth was missing, his knees were scraped, his smile reached his eyes. Every mother keeps photographs like that. Not because she forgets her child has grown, but because sometimes they're the only reminder that the little boy still exists somewhere beneath the man. I answered before the call ended. Hello, sweetheart. There was a brief pause, then Daniel's familiar voice. Hi, Mom. I leaned back into my chair. Outside my apartment window, the Atlanta skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Retirement has made my days quieter, sometimes too quiet. Most mornings were spent tending the small garden on my balcony. Afternoons were filled with books, church volunteer work, or helping neighbors organize their taxes. After 40 years as an accountant, numbers had become second nature. Even after retirement, people still knocked on my door asking for advice. I never minded. It made me feel useful. Daniel cleared his throat. I wanted to let you know something. I'm listening. Our company is hosting its annual foundation gala next Friday. I smiled. I remember you mentioned it a few months ago. It'll be pretty big. I'm sure it will. Our CEO invited several major investors. That's wonderful. And he hesitated. I'd like you to come. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because the invitation was extraordinary, because it was unexpected. Daniel rarely included me in his corporate life. He often explained that his work events were complicated, formal, professional. He always said I'd be bored, or that they were mostly business. This was the first invitation I'd received in years. You really want me there? Of course. His answer came quickly, almost too quickly. Still, I wanted to believe it. My heart had spent too many years searching for reasons to stay hopeful. I'd love to come. Great. I'll have your invitation sent over tomorrow. After a few more minutes, we ended the call. I sat quietly in my apartment, looking around the living room my late husband and I had shared for almost 45 years. His favorite reading chair still sat beside the window. I could never bring myself to move it. People often told me I should redecorate, start fresh, but some memories deserve a permanent place in a home. I looked toward the framed photograph resting on the fireplace. Harold smiled back at me, the same calm smile that had carried us through every hardship. I think he's finally proud of me. The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. It wasn't really about the gala. It wasn't about expensive hotels or wealthy executives. It was about something much simpler. My son wanted me beside him, or at least that's what I believed. The invitation arrived the following morning. Cream colored envelope, heavy cardstock, elegant gold lettering. Harrison Global Foundation Annual Leadership Gala. The Grand Regent Hotel. Black tie Friday evening. I traced my fingers gently across Daniel's name printed beneath the guest list. Vice President of Strategic Development. I smiled. Harold would have been so proud. Daniel had worked incredibly hard. Scholarships, long nights, graduate school, endless business trips. I remembered every sacrifice. the second mortgage we took to help pay for college, the weekends Harold spent working overtime, the vacations we skipped, the birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes because tuition came first. None of it had ever felt like a burden. That's what parents do. They quietly invest in futures they'll never fully see. I carried the invitation into my bedroom. At the back of my closet hung a navy evening gown. I hadn't worn it in nearly 8 years. It wasn't designer, it wasn't expensive, but Harold loved it. You look like elegance itself, he'd always say. I smiled through unexpected tears. I think you'll have one more night. The dress still fit surprisingly well, just a little loose around the waist. I laughed softly. Growing older wasn't all bad. The following morning, I visited my favorite tailor, then the dry cleaner, then the small jewelry box tucked safely inside my dresser. Inside rested a single strand of pearls. Harold had given them to me on our 25th wedding anniversary. He had apologized for months because he couldn't afford diamonds. I laughed every time he mentioned it. I never wanted diamonds. The pearls had become my most treasured possession, not because they were valuable, because they reminded me of a man who spent his entire life trying to make me smile. By Thursday evening, everything was ready. The dress, the pearls, matching shoes, a small silver evening clutch. I even scheduled an appointment to have my hair professionally styled. It felt wonderful preparing for something again. At church on Wednesday, my friend Margaret noticed the excitement in my voice. You look happier than you have in years. I smiled. Daniel invited me to his company's gala. Margaret's face brightened immediately. Oh, Eleanor, it's about time. I think so too. She squeezed my hand gently. You deserve this. Those words stayed with me, because if I was honest, part of me still wondered whether I did. Some mothers spend years questioning themselves. Did I love enough? Did I discipline too much? Did I protect him enough? Did I push too hard? Every distance between parent and child somehow becomes another question a mother asks herself. Friday finally arrived. I woke before sunrise, unable to sleep. The apartment felt unusually peaceful. I made coffee, opened the curtains. I watched the city slowly come alive. Then I looked at the invitation one final time. Tonight wasn't simply another event. Tonight felt like a new beginning. Maybe Daniel wanted our relationship to change. Maybe he finally realized how much time had passed. Maybe tonight would become the first chapter of something better. I believed that with all my heart. Sometimes hope isn't logical. Sometimes it's simply necessary. At 6 o'clock that evening, I slipped into my navy gown, fastened Harold's pearls around my neck. I looked into the mirror. For a moment, I didn't see an elderly widow. I saw the woman Harold had loved, the mother Daniel once adored. I picked up my evening purse, locked the apartment door, and whispered quietly to myself, tonight is going to be different. I had no idea that before the evening was over, my own son would ask security to keep me out of the building. There is a particular kind of silence that only humiliation creates. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps into a room, into a moment, into a person's soul. And by the time you recognize it, everyone else has already heard it too. The Grand Regent Hotel stood like a palace against the Atlanta skyline. Golden lights illuminated the entrance. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Valets hurried from one vehicle to another. Women in elegant gowns laughed beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, visible through the towering glass windows. Men in tailored tuxedos shook hands and embraced. The entire building radiated success. As my taxi pulled into the circular driveway, I felt my heart beating faster. Not from fear, from excitement. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere important. The driver stepped out and opened my door. "Big night?" he asked with a smile. I smiled back. "My son's event." He nodded. "Then you must be proud." I was. More than he could possibly know. I adjusted Harold's pearls, smoothed the fabric of my navy gown, picked up my silver clutch. Then I stepped onto the red carpet. The evening air felt warm, music drifted through the entrance doors. I remember smiling, actually smiling, because for a brief moment I truly believed this night would become one of my happiest memories. As I approached the entrance, two security officers greeted arriving guests. One scanned invitations, the other directed guests inside. I handed over my invitation. The younger officer smiled politely. "One moment, ma'am." I waited. People continued walking past me. The officer typed something into his tablet, then typed again. His smile disappeared. "I'm sorry." He looked confused. "I don't see your name." I laughed softly. "Oh, there must be a mistake." I handed him the invitation again. "My son works here." He examined it. Then I looked back at the screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the guest list." The words didn't make sense. Not immediately. "I'm afraid you must have the wrong list." "No, ma'am. I received this invitation from my son." "I'm sorry." The people behind me began to wait. I felt their eyes. The officer lowered his voice. "Could you step aside while I verify?" I nodded. Of course. It was simply a misunderstanding. Nothing more. I stepped to the side of the entrance. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Guests continued entering. Nobody looked at me. But somehow I felt seen by everyone. Finally, another security officer approached, older, more serious. "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks?" "Yes." "I'm afraid your invitation was revoked." I blinked. "What?" "Your name was removed from the guest registry." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, that can't be right." He looked uncomfortable. "I'm afraid it is." My mouth felt dry. "Who removed it?" The man hesitated. Then he spoke quietly. "Your son." I don't remember breathing. I remember hearing music, laughter, champagne glasses clinking. I remember staring at his face and waiting for him to smile, to tell me he was joking. Instead, he simply looked away. "No." The word escaped before I realized I'd spoken. "There must be some mistake." "I'm sorry, ma'am." "No." I shook my head. "My son invited me." "I'm aware." "Then call him." He paused, then touched his earpiece. A few moments later, I saw him, Daniel, walking toward the entrance. My son. My little boy with the missing front tooth. The child who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who cried when he left for college. The man I had spent my entire life loving. He approached wearing a black tuxedo, perfectly tailored. Confidence. Successful. For a moment, I felt relief. Of course, he would fix this. He would laugh, apologize, tell everyone there has been a misunderstanding. Instead, he stopped several feet away. He didn't hug me. He didn't smile. He didn't even look surprised. "Mom," his voice sounded flat. "Danny," I smiled nervously. "They say there's been some mistake." He glanced toward the security guards, then back at me. "There isn't." I felt the world shift beneath my feet. "What?" He exhaled heavily. "I didn't expect you to actually come." I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my mind refused to understand. You invited me. I sent the invitation because it was expected. I stared at him. I don't understand. He glanced toward the ballroom, toward the executives, the investors, the cameras. Then he lowered his voice. Mom, please don't do this. Do what? He rubbed his forehead. This event is important. I know. There are people here I need to impress. The sentence landed like a physical blow. I looked at him, really looked at him, and suddenly I realized he wasn't embarrassed by the situation. He was embarrassed by me. I don't understand. My voice barely existed anymore. I'm your mother. I know. Then why? He looked away. Then he said the words that would haunt me forever. Because you don't fit here. The sounds of the gala disappeared. The music, the laughter, the voices, everything. I could only hear my own heartbeat. After everything, after every sacrifice, after every sleepless night, after every dollar Harold and I had borrowed to pay his tuition, after every prayer, every birthday, every Christmas, every scraped knee, every broken heart, I had become something my son was ashamed to display, a liability, an inconvenience, an embarrassment. He reached into his pocket, pulled out some cash, and held it toward me. Take a cab home. I didn't take it. I couldn't. Because if I accepted that money, I would also have to accept what it represented, that I no longer belonged in his life. I looked at my son. The man standing before me looked nothing like the little boy I had raised. For the first time in 71 years, I didn't recognize him. I see. Those were the only words I could find. He looked relieved, as if the difficult part was finally over. Thank you, Mom. Thank you. I nodded slowly. Then I turned around. I began walking toward the street. One step, then another. I never made it to the sidewalk, because just as I reached the bottom of the hotel's grand staircase, a voice behind me said two words that would change everything. Eleanor Brooks? There are moments in life when everything you believe about yourself collapses, and then somehow a stranger appears and reminds you who you really are. I stopped walking. The voice behind me was calm, confidence, familiar, but not familiar enough for me to immediately recognize it. Eleanor Brooks? I turned slowly. Standing halfway down the grand staircase was a man in his late 60s. Silver hair, black tuxedo, perfect posture. The kind of face that looked comfortable in rooms filled with power. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He was staring at me, not with curiosity, not with pity, with recognition, as though he had been looking for me. I'm sorry, I said quietly. Do I know you? Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile people give strangers, the kind they give old friends. I was hoping you'd ask that. I looked at him. Nothing. No memory, no recognition. Just another wealthy man at another wealthy event. I'm afraid I don't remember. He laughed softly. That's because the last time you saw me, I was 27 years old, broke and sleeping in my office. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. He stepped closer. I worked at Henderson Accounting. My heart skipped. Henderson Accounting. I hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in over 30 years. That had been my second job after college. A small accounting firm downtown. Long hours, small paychecks, good people. Then suddenly, I saw him. Not the man standing before me. The young man. Thin, nervous. Always carrying stacks of papers. Always arriving early. Always leaving late. The young man who had spent every lunch break talking about some impossible business dream. Oh my goodness, the words escaped me. Michael? His smile widened. Finally. I couldn't believe it. Michael Harrison? He nodded. The world around us disappeared. The music, the lights, the guests, the humiliation, everything. Because standing in front of me was not just Michael Harrison. He was Michael Harrison, founder and CEO of Harrison Global, the company hosting the gala, the man whose face had appeared on magazine covers, the man Daniel had spoken about for years, the billionaire. I stared at him. You. He laughed. Yes. Oh my goodness. He shook his head. I've been trying to get your attention for the last 30 seconds. I'm sorry. No, his smile softened. Don't apologize. Then he looked at my face. I really looked at it. And his expression changed. What happened? I opened my mouth, then I closed it. How do you explain something like that? How do you explain that your own son had just asked security to remove you? How do you explain that the person you loved most in the world had become ashamed of you? I looked down at my purse. It's nothing. He frowned. Eleanor. That voice. The same voice from 35 years earlier. The voice of a young man who had once refused to quit. I felt tears threatening. Not because I wanted to cry, because I was exhausted from trying not to. The invitation was revoked. He stared. What? My son. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. I don't understand. He works here. I know he works here. He asks security to remove me. Silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind of silence that feels dangerous. The kind that arrives just before something breaks. Michael looked toward the entrance. The security officers immediately looked away. Then he looked back at me. Daniel Brooks? I nodded. His jaw tightened. Your son is Daniel Brooks? Yes. He said nothing, but something changed in his eyes. Not anger, something worse. Disappointment. As though a puzzle he had never expected to solve had suddenly fallen into place. I'm sorry. I don't know why I apologized. Perhaps because mothers spend their entire lives apologizing for the mistakes of their children. He shook his head. No. He looked directly at me. You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. The tears I'd been holding back finally escaped. Just one, then another. Not because I was weak, because someone had finally said what I needed to hear. He stepped closer. Eleanor. Yes? Did he really ask you to leave? I nodded. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the warmth was gone. Not toward me, toward someone else. Toward someone inside that ballroom. He turned toward the hotel entrance, then stopped. He faced me once more. Wait here, I wiped my eyes. What? Wait here. No. I shook my head immediately. Michael, please, I don't want to cause trouble. He smiled. The same stubborn smile I'd seen 35 years earlier. The trouble has already happened. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket. Then he said 7 words that made my heart stop. Nobody removes my business partner. I stared at him. My what? But he was already walking. Up the staircase, past security, through the golden doors of the ballroom. And for the first time that night, I realized I had absolutely no idea who Michael Harrison had become, or what he was about to do. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra suddenly stopped playing. I stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, alone, confused, humiliated, and suddenly terrified, because I had just heard the CEO of one of the largest companies in America call me his business partner. Business partner. The words echoed inside my head. There had to be some mistake, a misunderstanding, a memory distorted by time. I had known Michael Harrison 35 years ago, back when he was young, back when he was struggling, back when both of us still believed hard work alone could change a person's future. But a business partner? No, that wasn't possible. I took a step toward the entrance, then stopped. Through the enormous glass doors of the Grand Regent Ballroom, I could see hundreds of guests. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters carried champagne. Executives stood in small groups discussing markets, investments, acquisitions. This was Daniel's world, not mine. I should leave. That was the sensible thing to do. Call a taxi, go home, pretend none of this had happened. Pretend my son hadn't just told me I didn't belong. Pretend I hadn't spent the last 10 minutes discovering that sometimes strangers remember your worth better than family. I turned toward the street. Then I heard applause. The gala was beginning. Curiosity forced me to look back. Inside the ballroom, the lights dimmed. A spotlight illuminated the stage. The master of ceremony stepped forward. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The room fell silent. Thank you all for joining us for the Harrison Global Foundation Annual Leadership Gala. More applause. I could see Daniel now, standing near the front tables, smiling, relaxed, as though none of what had happened outside mattered, as though I had never been there, as though I had never existed. The host continued. Tonight, we're honored to celebrate not only our achievements, but the people who helped build them. More applause. And now, please welcome the founder and CEO of Harrison Global. The room erupted. People stood, executives applauded, investors smiled, cameras turned toward the stage. Then Michael Harrison walked into the spotlight. He looked different from the man I'd known. Older, stronger, more confident. But one thing hadn't changed. When Michael believed something was wrong, everyone knew it. He stood at the podium. The applause slowly faded. Then he looked out across the room. His eyes moved deliberately. One side of the ballroom, then the other, then the center. He didn't speak. 5 seconds passed. 10. People shifted in their seats. Daniel looked confused. The master of ceremonies looked confused. Everyone looked confused. Finally, Michael leaned toward the microphone. Before we begin, his voice echoed throughout the ballroom. I'm looking for someone. Nervous laughter spread through the room. Nobody understood. Michael continued. Can someone please explain why my business partner is standing outside this building? Silence. Absolute silence. I felt my heart stop. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of people froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The cameras remained pointed toward the stage. Daniel's face lost all color. He looked around, then toward the entrance, then back at the stage. I watched him realize exactly who Michael was talking about. And for the first time that evening, I saw fear. Real fear. Michael stepped away from the podium. No. His voice remained calm, but somehow even more dangerous. I'll ask again. He looked directly at the security director standing near the ballroom entrance. Why is Eleanor Brooks outside? The security director turned pale. A few executives whispered among themselves. The investors looked confused. Daniel looked like he could barely breathe. Then, something happened that nobody expected. Michael Harrison walked off the stage. Not after his speech. Not after introductions. Not after announcements. Before all of it. He walked away from the microphone. Past the front row investors. Past politicians. Past board members. Past journalists. Past my son. The ballroom remained silent. Hundreds of people watched him. Nobody understood what was happening, except Daniel, because Daniel understood exactly who Michael was coming for. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs. I wanted to run, to disappear, to avoid becoming part of whatever this was. But my feet wouldn't move. Then Michael reached me. He stopped, looked at me, and smiled. Not the smile of a billionaire, not the smile of a CEO, the smile of the young man I'd known decades earlier. Eleanor, I swallowed. Michael. He looked down at the pearls around my neck, then in my navy dress, then back at my face. You look exactly like I hoped you would. I stared at him. What is happening? He smiled again. The evening is finally beginning. Then he did something I never expected. In front of security, in front of the cameras, in front of hundreds of wealthy guests watching through the ballroom windows. Michael Harrison offered me his arm. Would you do me the honor of joining me? I looked at the arm, then at the ballroom, then my son. Daniel wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He simply stood there, watching the entire world he had carefully built begin to collapse. My hands started shaking. Michael. He leaned closer and quietly said the words that changed everything. They were never supposed to know tonight. I looked at him. What? He smiled. But I think your son made a different decision for us. Then Michael Harrison turned toward the ballroom and escorted me inside. I have often wondered whether humiliation and vindication feel similar, because as Michael Harrison escorted me into that ballroom, I couldn't tell the difference. The room stood perfectly still. Hundreds of people, executives, investors, politicians, journalists, board members, all watching. Not him. Me. The woman who had been standing outside the building less than 5 minutes earlier. The woman my own son had decided didn't belong. Michael walked slowly, deliberately, not because he enjoyed making an entrance, because he wanted every person in that room to understand something important. I wasn't following him. He was accompanying me. As we entered the ballroom, conversations died. The orchestra remained silent. Even the photographers stopped taking pictures. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me. I didn't look at him. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could survive seeing his face. Michael guided me toward the stage. Then, to my complete horror, he stopped and turned to face the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried effortlessly through the room. I owe all of you an apology. The room remained silent. I had planned to make a different speech tonight. A few people exchanged confused looks. But circumstances have changed, he smiled. And sometimes life reminds us that certain stories deserve to be told. Then he looked at me, not in the audience, not at the cameras, at me. Eleanor. My heart pounded. 35 years ago, I met a woman who changed the course of my life. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire ballroom seemed to lean forward. I was 27 years old. He laughed softly. I had one suit, $300, and a business plan that every investor in Atlanta had already rejected. A few people smiled politely. Others looked intrigued. I rented an office so small that my desk touched all four walls. The room laughed quietly, but I had one thing. He paused. Hope. His eyes remained fixed on me. And one person believed in that hope. My throat tightened. No, no, this couldn't be happening. I knew exactly where he was going, and I didn't want him to go there. Michael. He smiled. You always hated attention. The audience laughed gently. He turned back toward them. Eleanor Brooks was my senior accountant. The room remained silent. She worked harder than anyone in the office. She arrived first, left last, and somehow always found time to help a young man everyone else thought was wasting his life. A few people began nodding. Still, nobody understood. Not yet. Michael's expression grew serious. When every bank rejected me, he paused. When every investor laughed at me, another pause. When everyone told me to give up, he looked at me again. One person said yes. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I closed my eyes because I already knew I had carried this secret for 35 years, and tonight it was about to become public. Eleanor invested her inheritance. Gasps. Not many, just enough. Enough to change the atmosphere. Enough to make people sit up straighter. Enough to make Daniel stop breathing. I opened my eyes. He was staring at me. Not embarrassed, not ashamed, confused. Utterly confused. Michael continued. Not because she thought she'd become wealthy. Not because she wanted recognition. Because she believed in me. He laughed softly. Frankly, she was the only person who did. A few people smiled. Others stared at me. I wanted to disappear. Michael wasn't finished. She invested every dollar her parents left her. Silence. Then she spent nights helping me organize financial reports, preparing investor presentations, correcting projections, keeping my company alive. He shook his head. There would be no Harrison Global without Eleanor Brooks. This time, nobody laughed, nobody whispered, nobody moved, because everyone finally understood. The woman standing beside the CEO wasn't an honored guest. She wasn't a family member. She wasn't a former employee. She was one of the people who built the company. I looked toward Daniel. His face had gone completely white. He looked as though someone had removed the floor beneath him. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Michael, then at me, then back at Michael. The expression on his face wasn't just shock. It was a realization, because he understood what everyone else in that room now understood. The woman he had asked security to remove was one of the founders of the company hosting the gala. Michael smiled gently. The only condition Eleanor ever gave me was that her name remain private. He looked directly at me. You told me that if the company succeeded, the success should belong to the people building it. I felt tears forming, not because I was proud, because I had forgotten. I'd forgotten that version of myself, the woman who believed in impossible things, the woman who wasn't afraid, the woman Harold fell in love with. Michael turned back toward the audience. So for 35 years, I kept my promise. He paused. Until tonight. The ballroom remained silent. Then someone started clapping. One person, then another, then another. Within seconds, hundreds of people were standing, applauding, not politely, not professionally, emotionally. The sound filled the ballroom. I covered my mouth because I didn't know what else to do. I had spent the last decade feeling invisible, and suddenly hundreds of strangers were standing because of something I had done 35 years earlier. Through the applause, I looked toward Daniel. My son wasn't clapping. He wasn't moving. He was simply staring at me, as though he had just realized he had never actually known who his mother was. Then Michael stepped closer. He leaned toward me and quietly said something that made my knees weak. Eleanor. I looked at him. There's one more thing they don't know. The applause continued around us. What? He smiled. The company wasn't your greatest investment. I stared at him. Then he reached toward the podium and picked up a microphone. My heart stopped. I have learned something about applause. It sounds beautiful from a distance, but when you're standing in the center of it, carrying 35 years of memories, it can feel overwhelming. The ballroom remained standing. Hundreds of people, applauding, smiling, looking at me, not because of who I was, because of something I had done so long ago that I had almost forgotten it myself. I lowered my head, not out of embarrassment, out of disbelief. 35 years of silence, and suddenly everyone knew. The applause slowly faded. People sat down, but nobody looked away. Nobody checked their phones, nobody whispered. For the first time that evening, I understood that Michael Harrison wasn't giving a speech anymore. He was telling a story, and somehow I had become the center of it. Michael still held the microphone. He smiled at me, then looked toward the audience. I told you there was one more thing. A nervous laugh moved through the ballroom, the kind people use when they don't know what's coming next. I certainly didn't. What else could there possibly be? I asked quietly. Michael laughed. That's exactly what I asked her. The audience smiled. He walked slowly across the stage, the way he used to walk around our tiny office when he was trying to solve a problem. The first investment Eleanor made was money. He paused. The second investment was much more valuable. I stared at him. What was he talking about? He turned toward the audience. When Harrison Global finally became profitable, he smiled. I offered Eleanor a way out. I closed my eyes, because now I remembered. Not everything, just enough. Enough to know where this story was heading. Enough to know why my hands had started shaking. Most people would have sold. He looked around the ballroom. They would have taken the money. They would have protected themselves. They would have moved on. He looked directly at me, but Eleanor Brooks looked me in the eye and said 6 words. I could barely breathe. The room remained silent. Then he repeated them. I'm not investing in a company. He smiled. I'm investing in a person. The audience didn't react. Not immediately. Because they didn't understand. Not yet. Michael nodded slowly. And because she believed in me, he took a deep breath. I gave her something that nobody else in the world received. He reached inside his jacket pocket, then pulled out a small black leather folder. The entire ballroom leaned forward. Daniel stood frozen. I don't think he had blinked in several minutes. Michael opened the folder, then held it up. 35 years ago, Eleanor Brooks became the first private equity partner in Harrison Global. The room exploded. Not with applause, with shock, gasps, whispers, confusion. People turned toward each other. Investors looked stunned. Board members stared. Journalists immediately reached for their phones. I felt my knees weaken because I knew what they were all calculating, what they were all trying to understand. Not history, the value. Michael smiled. She never sold. The room became quiet again. Not because people stopped reacting, because they had started thinking, and what they were thinking terrified me. No, no, please don't. But Michael wasn't finished. He looked at me, the same grateful expression I'd seen on his face 35 years earlier. She refused dividends. I closed my eyes. She refused publicity. I remembered. She refused interviews. I remembered all of it. Because I had never wanted recognition. I simply wanted to help someone who believed in an impossible dream. Michael smiled. And because she never sold, he looked at the audience, then finally said the words that changed the room forever. Eleanor Brooks remains the second largest individual shareholder of Harrison Global. Silence. The kind of silence that only comes after reality changes. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked toward Daniel. My son wasn't pale anymore. He looked broken. Completely broken. Because in one terrible moment, he had realized the truth. He hadn't thrown out an old woman who didn't belong. He had thrown out one of the owners of the company, a company worth billions. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. Someone in the audience finally spoke. How much? The question escaped before anyone could stop it. Michael smiled. I was hoping nobody would ask. The audience laughed nervously. Then he looked directly at me. May I? I wanted to say no. I wanted to stop this. I wanted to disappear. But somehow I couldn't. I nodded. He turned back toward the audience. Based on today's market valuation, he paused. The shares Eleanor Brooks still owns are currently valued at approximately. The entire ballroom held its breath. $843 million. Nothing. No sound, no movement, no reaction. Because nobody believed what they had just heard. Not the journalists, not the investors, not the politicians, and certainly not my son. Then, slowly, I watched Daniel sit down. Not because he wanted to, because his legs gave out. I didn't look at anyone else. I only looked at him. Because for the first time all evening, I understood something. The greatest shock wasn't discovering who I was. It was discovering that my own son had never cared enough to find out. The ballroom remained frozen. Then Michael walked toward me and held out the microphone. Eleanor. My heart stopped. No, he smiled. Yes. I can't. He leaned closer. 35 years ago, you gave me a voice. He placed the microphone gently into my hand. I think it's time the world heard yours. There are moments in life when you discover that courage doesn't feel like strength. It feels like terror. I stared at the microphone in Michael's hand. The entire ballroom was watching. Hundreds of people. Executives, investors, journalists, politicians, board members. And somewhere among them, my son, the same son who had asked security to remove me less than an hour earlier. No. The word escaped before I could stop it. Michael smiled gently. Yes, I can't. He stepped closer. Eleanor. His voice softened. Do you remember what you told me 35 years ago? I looked at him. He smiled. You said that fear usually means you're standing in front of something important. A few people laughed softly. I closed my eyes. Of course I remembered. Michael had been terrified before his first investor presentation. He'd wanted to cancel, to quit, to disappear. And I had spent an entire night convincing him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was walking forward while afraid. I opened my eyes. The ballroom remained silent, waiting, watching, hoping. Slowly, I reached for the microphone. The applause began immediately. Not because I had spoken, because I had accepted. I looked out across the ballroom, the lights, the faces, the cameras, the people. For a brief moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then my eyes found Daniel. He wasn't looking at the CEO. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking at me. The way children look at their parents when they suddenly realize they have misunderstood them their entire lives. I took a deep breath, then another, and finally I spoke. I wasn't expecting this tonight. The audience laughed gently. Thank God. At least my voice worked. I actually thought tonight was going to be a very different experience. More laughter, not because it was funny, because everyone understood. I smiled. To be honest, I almost didn't come. The ballroom became quiet again. I spent most of this week wondering whether I belonged here. I paused. Then I looked at Michael. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. This time, the audience laughed harder. Even Michael laughed. But Daniel didn't, because he understood exactly what I meant. I looked down at the microphone, then back at the audience. When Michael asked me to invest in his company, I smiled. He wasn't Michael Harrison. The audience smiled. He was a young man with terrible suits. The room erupted with laughter. He had impossible dreams, very little money, and absolutely no ability to stop talking. Even Michael laughed at that. But he had something else. I paused. He had character. The room became quiet. I looked at Michael. He was grateful. He was humble. He treated people with respect. Then I looked toward Daniel, not dramatically, not angrily, just long enough, just honestly enough. And everyone noticed. That's why I invested. The silence deepened, not because I believed in a business, because I believed in a person. I could see journalists writing, investors nod, executives listening, but none of them mattered. There was only one person I wanted to hear me, my son. I've learned something after 71 years. I smiled. Money is useful. A few people laughed. Success is wonderful. More smiles. But neither of those things determines a person's worth. Silence. The way we treat people determines our worth. I looked around the ballroom, especially the people who loved us before we became successful. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, because everyone understood, not the details, the truth. I continued. When my husband and I raised our son, my voice caught, just slightly. We never dreamed he would become wealthy. I looked toward Daniel. We only hoped he would become kind. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. No movement, no whispers, no applause, just the truth. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, I watched my son's face collapse. Not from embarrassment, not from humiliation, from understanding. Real understanding. The kind that hurts. I looked down for a moment, then smiled. The funny thing about being a parent, I wiped away a tear. Is it that you never stop believing the best version of your child still exists? My voice became softer. Even the microphone seemed quieter. No matter how old they become, no matter how successful they become, no matter how far away they drift. I looked directly at Daniel, and sometimes I smiled through tears. You simply wait for them to find their way back. The room remained completely silent. Then something happened. Daniel stood. At first, I thought he was leaving. I wouldn't have blamed him, but he wasn't walking toward the exit. He was walking toward the stage, toward me, toward everyone. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room wasn't Michael Harrison. It wasn't the investors. It wasn't the politicians. It was my son. Because he had decided to do the hardest thing a person can ever do: tell the truth. There is something extraordinary about silence. Not the silence of empty rooms, the silence that follows truth. My son stood at the bottom of the stage. Hundreds of people watched him. Investors, politicians, journalists, executives. Some of the most powerful people in the country. And yet I had never seen Daniel look smaller. He climbed the steps slowly, not because he was afraid of falling, because he knew there was nowhere left to hide. The ballroom remained silent. No cameras flashed, no one whispered. Everyone understood that whatever happened next mattered more than the gala. Daniel stopped beside me. For a moment, he couldn't look at me. He stared at the microphone in my hand, then on the floor, then finally at me. I saw it immediately. Not embarrassment, not humiliation, grief. The kind of grief that comes when someone realizes they have become the very person they never intended to be. He reached for the microphone. His hand shook, not a little, a lot. Michael quietly stepped backward. The entire ballroom seemed to disappear around us. There was only my son, the little boy with the missing front tooth, the teenager who cried when his father taught him to drive, the young man who promised he would never forget where he came from. He took a breath, then another, and finally he spoke. I don't deserve to stand here. No one moved, no one interrupted. I don't deserve to stand beside my mother. His voice cracked. The sound broke something inside me because I realized this wasn't a speech. It was a confession. I spent my entire career trying to become successful. He laughed bitterly, and I succeeded. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared, then it disappeared. I bought the house, the cars, the clothes, the memberships, the reputation. His eyes filled with tears. But somewhere along the way, he stopped. His voice failed. He tried again. I started believing those things made me valuable. The room remained silent. And when I looked at my mother, he turned toward me. I didn't see the woman who built my life. A tear rolled down his face. I saw the life I was trying to escape. I closed my eyes, not because I wanted to, because hearing the truth hurts differently than hearing a lie. He continued. When I was growing up, we didn't have much. His voice trembled. I hated it. I hated being the poor kid. I hated the old car. I hated the small apartment. I hated watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion. The room remained still. I promised myself that when I became successful, he laughed again. I would never feel that ashamed again. Then he looked at me and finally said the words that explained everything. The problem was, I never stopped being ashamed. The silence that followed felt endless because everyone understood, not just what he had done. Why did he do it? He wasn't ashamed of me. He was ashamed of himself, ashamed of where he came from, ashamed of the sacrifices that had built his future, ashamed of the people who loved him before anyone else did. He wiped his eyes. Then I looked out at the audience. When my mother arrived tonight, his voice cracked again. I didn't see my mother. He looked down. I saw a reminder. The words hurt, but they were true. And truth has a strange kind of mercy, because once it is spoken, it can finally begin to heal. I told security to remove her. He didn't hide. He didn't soften it. He didn't make excuses. I was afraid. He turned toward me, not of her, of myself. The tears came faster now. I was terrified that people would look at her. He stopped, then whispered, and see where I came from. The room remained silent. Nobody judged him. Nobody laughed, because every person in that ballroom had something they were ashamed of. He looked at me, really looked at me, and suddenly he wasn't 50 years old. He was 5. I'm sorry, Mom. The words barely existed. I'm so sorry. I stared at my son, at the man who had broken my heart. As a child, I had never stopped loving. And suddenly, I understood something. He hadn't become cruel. He had become afraid. Afraid of being ordinary. Afraid of being poor. Afraid of being the person he used to be. And fear had turned him into someone neither of us recognized. He dropped to his knees, in front of everyone. The room gasped, not because it was dramatic, because it was real. He held on to my hand, the same way he had when he was a child afraid of thunderstorms. I spent my whole life trying to become successful. He looked up at me, and tonight I realized his voice disappeared, then returned. I already came from someone extraordinary. The tears I had been holding back all evening finally escaped. Not because I had won, because I had gotten my son back. And as I looked out across that ballroom filled with billionaires, politicians, and powerful people, I realized something. The richest person in the room wasn't me. It wasn't Michael Harrison. It wasn't anyone sitting at those tables. It was a mother hearing her child finally tell the truth. And in that moment, I knew the gala was over, but our story was just beginning. People often ask what happened after that night. They expect me to tell them about the money, about the company, about the headlines. Because, yes, there were headlines. By the next morning, photos from the gala had spread everywhere. The billionaire CEO's secret business partner, the mother who built an empire, the woman behind Harrison Global. For 3 days, reporters called. For 3 weeks, television producers reached out. For 3 months, people I hadn't spoken to in decades suddenly remembered my phone number. But that's not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters happened after the ballroom emptied, after the journalists left, after the investors stopped congratulating me, after the orchestra packed their instruments, after the lights dimmed. It happened in silence. The ballroom was nearly empty when I finally sat down. For the first time in hours, I felt tired. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of tiredness that only comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time. Michael sat beside me. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just Michael, the young man I had believed in all those years ago. He smiled. "You okay?" I laughed softly. "I think so. I ruined your quiet life. You saved my terrible evening." He smiled. "Fair trade." For a moment, we sat quietly together. Then he looked toward the ballroom entrance. "He's waiting." I knew immediately who he meant. Daniel. I hadn't seen him for almost 30 minutes. After the speech, dozens of people surrounded him. Executives, board members, friends, reporters. I wondered what they had said. I wondered what he had said. But mostly, I wondered whether he still felt ashamed. Michael stood. He needs his mother. Then he walked away, leaving me alone. A few moments later, I heard footsteps. Slow, uncertain. The footsteps of someone approaching a door they weren't sure would open. I turned. Daniel stood there. Not the executive, not a successful businessman, not a polished professional. Just my son. His eyes were red, his tie was loose, his shoulders looked smaller somehow. For a long time, neither of us spoke, because sometimes the most important conversations begin with silence. Finally, he sat down beside me, not too close, not too far, exactly where a person sits when they don't know if they're still welcome. "I'm sorry." The words were barely audible. I nodded. "I know." He stared at the floor. "I don't know when I became that person." His voice cracked. "The man at the door. The man who was ashamed of his own mother." I reached for his hand. The same hand I had held crossing streets. The same hand I had held at funerals. The same hand I had held when he was afraid. "You didn't become that person." He looked at me. "Then who was I?" I smiled sadly. "Someone who forgot." He closed his eyes. "I forgot everything." "No." I squeezed his hand. "You forgot what mattered." The tears came again. Not because he was weak, because he was finally being honest. I thought success meant becoming someone different. I nodded. Most people do. I spent my entire life running from where I came from. His voice broke. And tonight I realized I was running from the people who loved me. The ballroom remained silent around us. The cleaning staff worked quietly in the distance. The musicians had gone home. The flowers still decorated the tables. The evening was over. But something else had begun. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I smiled. No child earns a mother's love. He stared at me. "What do you mean?" I laughed softly. "If children had to earn it, none of you would survive." For the first time all night, he smiled. A real smile. The smile of the little boy with the missing front tooth. The smile I thought I'd lost forever. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked toward the empty stage. The microphone still sat there, waiting. "I wanted you to build your own success." He frowned. "Even after everything you did?" I nodded. "Especially after everything I did." He looked confused, so I told him the truth. The greatest investment I ever made wasn't Harrison Global. He looked at me. "It wasn't?" I shook my head. "No." "What was it?" I smiled. "You." The tears returned instantly. For both of us. Because suddenly he understood. The money, the company, the shares, the wealth. None of it mattered. Not compared to raising a child. Not compared to believing in someone. Not compared to loving someone enough to sacrifice everything. He leaned forward, and for the first time in many years, my son hugged me. Not the quick, polite hugs adults give each other. A real hug, the kind children give when they're afraid, the kind people give when they finally come home. We stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the pain to begin turning into something else, hope. A few weeks later, Daniel resigned from his position, not because he had to, because he wanted to. He took 6 months off. He visited me every Sunday. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes healing doesn't require words. Michael and I remained friends. He still calls me his business partner. I still tell him he's exaggerating. And every year since that night, on the anniversary of the gala, the three of us have dinner together. Not at a luxury hotel, not at a corporate event, at my apartment with homemade food. Because some things are too important to outsource. People still ask me if I regret keeping my secret for 35 years. I always give them the same answer: no. Because the greatest investment I ever made wasn't money. It wasn't shared. It wasn't a company. It was believing in people before they believed in themselves. One investment built a $1 billion company. The other rebuilt my family. And if you ask me which investment mattered more, I already know the answer. If you've ever felt forgotten by someone you love, remember this. Never measure your worth by another person's ability to see it. Sometimes the people closest to us forget who we are. That doesn't mean we've lost our value. It only means they've lost their perspective. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is wait for them to find their way home. Thank you for spending this evening with me. And until next time, never underestimate the value of believing in someone, especially yourself. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like someone you loved was ashamed of where they came from? Maybe it was a son, a daughter, a spouse, or perhaps it was you. If this story touched your heart, please share your experience in the comments below. I read every comment, and your stories remind others that they are not alone. And tell me honestly, if you were Eleanor, would you have forgiven Daniel after what he did? Or would you have walked away? If this story reminded you that your value does not depend on someone else's ability to see it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we share stories about family, betrayal, redemption, dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet strength it takes to keep loving when life gives you every reason not to. Remember, the people who truly matter won't love you because of your success. They'll love you because of who you are. Thank you for spending this journey with me. And until our next story, never forget your worth.